Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax as the first light of dawn crept over the rolling hills of ancient Britain. The land stirred with the whispers of a prophecy long foretold. The morning mist wove its way through the gnarled trees and crumbling stones, carrying secrets of an age when magic still thrived and fate was written in the stars. Among these whispered legends, none shone brighter than the tale of the child who would be king, the one destined to wield the mighty Excalibur, unite a fractured land, and lead his people into an age of glory. But Arthur's story did not begin in a grand palace or on the battlefield of heroes. It began in the shadows, wrapped in mystery, with the guiding hand of a sorcerer who had seen what others could not. Merlin, the enigmatic seer, stood atop a rocky outcrop, his piercing gaze locked onto the valley below. He had long foreseen the chaos to come, a land torn apart by greed and ambition, noble houses vying for control, warlords spilling blood over thrones they had no right to claim. Britain, fragile and divided, needed a ruler unlike any before. But not just any king, a chosen one, born of both mortal and mystical lineage, a soul tied to the land itself. And so, with the weight of prophecy on his shoulders, Merlin set his plan into motion. The threads of destiny wove themselves around other Pendragon, a powerful and ambitious king. He ruled with strength, but was often consumed by his own desires. His heart, restless and fierce, had fallen for Igraine, the wife of Duke Gorlois of Cornwall. It was not love that drove others' obsession, but an uncontrollable hunger. And in his desperation, he sought Merlin's aid. The sorcerer, always playing the long game, saw this as an opportunity. He agreed to help other, but at a cost. The child born from this union would not belong to the king. He would be claimed by fate, guided by magic, and shaped by trials only the gods could foresee. Other, blinded by desire, agreed without question. Under the veil of night, Merlin wove his spell. Other was transformed, his face and form taking on the likeness of Gorlois. He entered Tintagel Castle undetected, and in the arms of Igraine, Arthur was conceived. That very night, fate was sealed, and the wheels of destiny turned with quiet certainty. But as swiftly as fortune granted Other his wish, it took everything from him. Gorlois was slain in battle, and Igraine, unaware of the deception, was wed to Other soon after. Yet, true to his word, Merlin came for the child. The newborn Arthur was taken under the cover of darkness, his cries lost to the howling wind. He was not raised as a prince, not cradled in silks, nor lavished with the luxuries of a king's son. Instead, he was placed in the care of Sir Ector, a noble yet humble knight, who raised him as his own alongside his son, Kay. Arthur grew up not in the golden halls of Camelot, but in a modest home, tending to stables, training with wooden swords, and learning the ways of honor, discipline, and humility. His hands, though small, bore the strength of a warrior in the making. He did not yet know the truth of his bloodline, nor did he suspect that his fate had already been written in the stars. As the years passed, Arthur's spirit burned bright. He was quick of mind, sharp of instinct, and carried a kindness that set him apart. While other boys dreamed of glory and conquest, Arthur found joy in the simple acts of service, helping the weary traveler, tending to the wounded, standing up for the weak. The lessons of his childhood, unassuming as they were, would shape him into the leader he was destined to become. Yet, even in this quiet life, shadows of the past loomed ever near. Merlin watched from afar, ensuring Arthur's path remained steady, nudging fate where needed. He knew the time would come when Arthur would step into the light, when he would take up the sword that had awaited him for so long. But before that moment, the boy had much to learn about strength, sacrifice, and the heavy burden of a crown. And so, the stage was set. The child of prophecy had been born, hidden from those who would seek to destroy him, raised in the unlikeliest of places. But destiny does not wait forever. Soon, Arthur would face the first great test of his life, one that would change not only his fate, but the fate of Britain itself. For deep in the heart of the land, buried in stone, Excalibur awaited its rightful king. The air was crisp with the promise of change as Arthur raced through the dew-laden fields, his breath coming in short, determined bursts. Though just a boy, he moved with an effortless grace, his body honed by years of training alongside Kay, the son of Sir Ector. To the world, Arthur was nothing more than a squire, a nameless youth who lived in the shadow of nights. But fate had already begun to stir, weaving its unseen threads around him, preparing him for the moment that would change everything. In the heart of Britain, a great tournament had been declared. With no rightful heir upon the throne, the land teetered on the brink of anarchy. Lords and knights, each thirsting for power, sought to prove their worth through battle, hoping that strength alone would determine the next ruler. It was a time of uncertainty, a fragile moment where destiny held its breath. Arthur, still unaware of his true lineage, had accompanied Kay to the tournament, serving as his loyal squire. The bustling streets of the city overwhelmed him, the clang of blacksmiths hammering steel, the shouts of merchants peddling wares, the distant roar of the crowd gathered around the lists where knights clashed in battle. It was a world unlike the quiet home he had known, and yet something about it stirred a fire deep within him. But fate often reveals itself in the smallest of moments. As Kay prepared for his match, a sudden realization struck his sword was missing. In the commotion of the morning, he had left it behind, and without it, he could not compete. Panic flickered across his face, but Arthur, ever resourceful, offered to fetch a replacement. With no time to waste, he sprinted through the city, his eyes darting frantically for a weapon. It was then, in the courtyard of an ancient cathedral, that he saw it, a sword unlike any other. It stood embedded in stone, its hilt glistening in the morning light, as if waiting. An inscription lay etched upon the metal. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone is rightwise king born of all England. Arthur had no time to ponder the meaning. He needed a sword, and this one stood before him, unguarded, forgotten, amid the chaos of the tournament. He stepped forward, wrapping his fingers around the hilt. The air around him seemed to still. A strange energy coursed through his veins, something ancient, something powerful. He pulled. The sword slid free, as if it had merely been resting there all along, waiting for the right hands to claim it. For a moment, Arthur simply stared, unable to comprehend what he had done. But there was no time for hesitation. Clutching the blade, he ran back to Kay, presenting it without thought. Kay's eyes widened as he beheld the weapon. Murmurs spread like wildfire, whispers turning into shouts. And soon, the gathered lords and knights turned their gaze upon Arthur. Word reached Sir Ector, who, upon seeing the sword, knew the truth could no longer remain hidden. The tournament came to a halt as Arthur was led back to the courtyard. A hushed anticipation filled the air as knights and nobles, one by one, attempted to return the sword to its stone, only to fail. When Arthur's turn came, he hesitated, then carefully lowered the blade back into its resting place. A breathless silence followed. Then, with ease, he pulled it free once more. The crowd erupted. Merlin, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward at last. His voice, rich with wisdom, rang out above the cheers. The king has returned. Arthur's mind reeled as the world shifted beneath his feet. The simple life he had known was gone. He was no longer just a squire, no longer the nameless boy who had spent his days in the fields. He was something more, something greater. But with greatness came burden. As the celebrations stretched through the night, Arthur withdrew into the quiet corners of the city, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He had never sought power, never craved the weight of a crown. How could he rule a kingdom when he had never even known he was meant to? It was in this moment of doubt that Merlin found him. The old sorcerer sat beside him, watching the flickering torchlight dance across the stone walls. "I never wanted this," Arthur whispered. "I am not ready." Merlin studied him for a long moment before speaking. No one is ever ready for destiny, but destiny does not wait. Arthur turned, searching the old man's eyes for answers, for a way to refuse what had been thrust upon him. But deep down, he knew there was no denying it. The sword had chosen him. The land had chosen him. And so, with the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders, Arthur took his first step into legend. The fires of celebration still burned in the city, but Arthur felt no joy in them. He had pulled the sword from the stone, had heard the roars of the crowd chanting his name, but the weight of what it meant pressed down on him like an iron chain. He had spent his life believing himself a simple squire, nothing more than the adopted son of Sir Ector. Now, he was expected to be a king. Merlin walked beside him in the quiet of the night, his staff tapping lightly against the cobbled streets. The old sorcerer had revealed little since the moment Arthur had drawn Excalibur, but there was a certainty in his gaze that unsettled the young man. "Tell me the truth," Arthur finally said, stopping near an old stone well. "Who am I?" Merlin studied him for a moment before answering. "You are the son of Other Pendragon and Igraine of Cornwall. You were taken from your mother the night you were born, hidden away so that you might grow up safe, away from the schemes of those who would see you dead." Arthur's hands tightened into fists. "And my mother, does she know what became of me? She knew only that her child was taken for his own protection. She never saw you again." Merlin's voice was gentle, yet it carried the weight of regret. "But you were never meant to remain hidden, Arthur. The sword in the stone was the sign that the time had come. Britain needs a true king." Arthur turned away, his thoughts in turmoil. His entire life had been a lie. Sir Ector had raised him with kindness, but he had never told him the truth. And now he was expected to lead a land he barely understood. "I don't know how to be a king," he said quietly. "No king ever does," Merlin replied. "Not at first." The sorcerer stepped forward, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Your heart is good, Arthur. That is what matters. A king is not made by blood or birthright alone. He is shaped by the choices he makes, by the burdens he is willing to bear for his people." Arthur closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words settle over him. He had no desire for a crown, no hunger for power. But he could not ignore the truth. Britain was a land divided, broken by war and greed. If he did not step forward, another would. And there was no telling if they would rule with justice or with cruelty. The first test of his reign came sooner than expected. Not all the lords of Britain had accepted Arthur's claim. Many scoffed at the idea of a mere boy wielding a sword and calling himself king. Among them was Lot of Orkney, a powerful warlord with ambitions of his own. He had arrived at the tournament expecting to see a new ruler chosen through battle, only to watch a nameless squire pull a sword from stone and be hailed as sovereign. He would not accept such an outcome. "This is trickery," Lot had bellowed in the Hall of Nobles. "No child will rule over me. If this boy wishes to be king, let him prove it on the battlefield." A murmur of agreement spread through the chamber. Many of the assembled lords harbored ambitions of their own and would rather see Britain remain in chaos than bow to a new ruler. Arthur, standing before them, felt the weight of their judgment. He had never commanded an army, had never led men into battle. But he knew that if he did not act now, his claim to the throne would crumble before it had even begun. Merlin leaned in close. "You must rally those who believe in you," he whispered. "You will not win Britain in a single day, Arthur, but you can take the first step." Arthur took a steadying breath and stepped forward. His voice, though young, carried through the hall with quiet strength. "If any man here would challenge me, let him do so openly," he said. "But know this, pull this sword from the stone for my own glory. I did it because the land has chosen me, and I will not turn away from the duty that comes with it." There was silence. Then, from the back of the room, a single knight stepped forward. He was broad-shouldered, his face lined with the scars of 100 battles. It was Sir Bedivere, a warrior of great renown. "I will fight for you," Bedivere said simply. Another voice rose from the crowd. "And I," said Sir Kay, Arthur's foster brother, stepping beside him. One by one, knights came forward: Sir Gawain, Sir Percival, Sir Bors. They were not the mightiest army, not yet, but they were men of honor, and they saw in Arthur something greater than ambition. Lot of Orkney scowled, but did not back down. "Then let it be war," he spat, before turning on his heel and storming from the hall. And so, Arthur's first battle as king was set, as he stood among those who had pledged their loyalty. He felt the first stirrings of something new, not fear, but purpose. He would not allow Britain to be torn apart by greed and ambition. He would fight, not for power, but for the people. Merlin watched him carefully, seeing the first embers of true kingship ignite within the boy. The road ahead would not be easy, and Arthur would face trials greater than he could yet imagine. But this was the moment that mattered, the moment when a squire became a leader, when doubt was cast aside and destiny was embraced. And so, as the dawn rose over Britain once more, Arthur prepared to fight for the throne that had been promised to him by fate itself. The wind howled across the battlefield, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the tension of an impending storm. Arthur sat astride his horse, Excalibur resting in his grip, the weight of the blade both reassuring and immense. Before him stretched the forces of Lot of Orkney, hardened warriors clad in dark steel, their banners snapping like hungry wolves in the wind. This was no tournament, no training ground. This was war. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest. He had trained with Sir Ector and Kay, had sparred in the fields of his childhood, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Yet, as he glanced to his side, he saw knights who had sworn their loyalty: Bedivere, Gawain, Kay, and others who had believed in him when so many had doubted. He was not alone. Merlin stood atop a nearby hill, his cloak billowing like a storm cloud. His eyes, ever watchful, held neither fear nor uncertainty. He had seen the shape of the future, had guided Arthur to this moment, but the battle itself belonged to the young king. Lot's forces began to advance, shields locking, their war cries rolling like thunder. Arthur gripped Excalibur tighter, its hilt fitting into his palm as though it had always belonged there. "For Britain," he cried, spurring his horse forward. His knights followed, a wave of steel and fury crashing into the enemy ranks. The clash of swords rang through the valley, a brutal symphony of war. Arthur fought with instinct, his movements swift and decisive. He did not fight like a noble, nor did he strike with reckless rage. His blade moved with purpose, guided by something deeper than skill, destiny itself. Excalibur cleaved through enemy ranks, its edge gleaming unnaturally bright even in the gloom. Legends spoke of the sword's unbreakable nature, of the magic woven into its steel, and now Arthur felt it. It was as though the sword fought with him, its power an extension of his own resolve. But war was not won by a single sword alone. Lot of Orkney, a warrior of great renown, cut his way through the battlefield, his eyes locked onto Arthur. He was larger, stronger, his strikes filled with years of experience and hardened fury. When their blades finally met, it was like the meeting of storm and stone. "You are no king," Lot snarled, his blade crashing down. Arthur barely parried in time, the force sending him stumbling back. He gritted his teeth, adjusting his stance. "The land has chosen me. Whether you believe it or not does not change my duty." Lot's next strike was wild, filled with rage, but Arthur saw it coming. He sidestepped, driving Excalibur forward, slicing across Lot's armor. The warlord staggered, his sword slipping from his grasp. Arthur could have ended it then, one swift stroke, and his first great enemy would fall. But he hesitated. Lot saw his chance and lunged. But before his blade could find its mark, another sword intervened. Sir Bedivere stepped in, his strike swift and merciless. Lot fell, his body crumpling to the blood-soaked earth. Silence fell over the battlefield. Lot's men, leaderless and spent, faltered. Some surrendered, others fled. The battle was won. Arthur stood amidst the carnage, his breath heavy, his hands trembling. He had claimed victory, but at what cost? The dead lay scattered, knights and soldiers alike, their lifeblood soaking into the land he was meant to protect. He had won the battle, but the true war, the war for Britain's soul, was only beginning. As his knights gathered, Sir Bedivere placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You hesitated," he said quietly. Arthur looked down at Lot's fallen form. "He was my enemy, but he was still a man," he murmured. "A king should not revel in death." Bedivere nodded, respect flickering in his gaze. "Then you will be a different kind of king." That night, as the fires of the fallen burned, Merlin approached Arthur once more. "Today, you proved yourself in battle," the sorcerer said, his voice calm yet firm. "But war alone does not make a king. Strength must be tempered with wisdom. And for that, you must look beyond the sword." Arthur turned to him, exhaustion weighing on his bones. "Then teach me," he said. "Show me how to be the king this land needs." Merlin smiled, the embers of the fire casting shadows across his face. "Then we begin at first light." And so, as the stars wheeled overhead, Arthur Pendragon, the boy who had once been a nameless squire, took his first steps toward becoming the king he was destined to be. The days that followed the battle were filled with both triumph and uncertainty. The land murmured with the name of its new king, Arthur Pendragon, the boy who had pulled the sword from the stone, the warrior who had defeated Lot of Orkney. Yet, for every voice that hailed him, another whispered in doubt. Some lords remained skeptical, unwilling to bend the knee to a ruler they deemed untested. Others saw opportunity, seeking to manipulate the young king for their own gain. Arthur, though victorious, knew his true battle had only begun. A kingdom was not won with a single sword stroke, nor was it ruled by the might of warriors alone. Britain was fractured, its people divided by greed and ambition, and if he was to unite them, he needed something more than Excalibur. He needed wisdom. And so, under the guidance of Merlin, Arthur's education as a ruler truly began. The old sorcerer took Arthur away from the battlefield, away from the courts of scheming nobles, and led him deep into the heart of the land. Together, they traveled through quiet villages and bustling markets, through war-torn settlements and ancient forests where the old magic still lingered. Arthur had spent his youth among knights, but now he walked among his people not as a king, but as one of them. "They do not know me," Arthur said one evening as they sat by a humble fire in a village far from Camelot's walls. He watched the villagers move about their lives, tending to their fields, mending their homes, laughing despite the hardships they faced. To them, I am only a name, a face they have never seen. Merlin stirred the embers with his staff. A king should not rule from the shadows of a palace. He must know the land, feel its heartbeat, understand its people, not as subjects, but as family. Arthur listened, and as the days passed, he learned. He saw the hunger in the eyes of farmers whose lands had been ravaged by warlords, the weariness of blacksmiths who toiled to forge weapons for battles they did not believe in. He spoke with elders who remembered the days before Britain had fallen into strife, and with children who dreamed of a future without war. He learned that a kingdom was not built upon stone walls, but upon the hopes and struggles of those who called it home. But not all his lessons came from the land of men. One night, under the silver light of a full moon, Merlin led Arthur to the edge of a still lake. The water shimmered with an unnatural glow, and the air hummed with a presence unseen. "Why have you brought me here?" Arthur asked. Merlin did not answer. Instead, he gestured toward the water's surface. Arthur stepped forward, and as he did, the lake rippled not from the wind, but from something beneath. Slowly, a hand emerged from the depths, pale and ethereal, holding a gleaming sword. It was Excalibur, yet different. Its blade shone with a light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and its hilt bore symbols that seemed older than time itself. "The Lady of the Lake," Merlin said softly. "She is the guardian of this sword, the keeper of ancient power." Arthur hesitated before reaching out. As his fingers wrapped around the hilt, a surge of energy coursed through him. Visions flickered through his mind, battles yet to be fought, victories yet to be won, sacrifices yet to be made. The sword was his, but it carried a warning. "The blade is unbreakable," Merlin said, his voice solemn. "But its power is tied to the heart of the one who wields it. As long as you rule with honor, it will serve you. But should you stray from the path of righteousness, even Excalibur will fail you. Arthur tightened his grip. Then I will wield it with honor. The Lady of the Lake slowly withdrew beneath the water, vanishing into the depths as if she had never been there at all. The lake stilled once more, but the weight of the moment lingered. Arthur turned to Merlin. The sword, the battles, the throne, is this all I am meant for? Merlin's gaze was distant, as though looking at a future he could not yet reveal. A king's journey is never simple, he said at last. You will face trials beyond the battlefield, betrayals that will test your heart, and choices that will shape the fate of all. Arthur said nothing. He did not need to. He had accepted his destiny the day he pulled the sword from the stone. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. As dawn broke over the horizon, Arthur and Merlin began their journey back to Camelot. There was much to be done. The nobles still whispered in doubt. The warlords still plotted, and the kingdom still stood on the edge of uncertainty. But Arthur had seen the people, had felt the pulse of the land, had held the power of Excalibur in his hands, and he knew, with a certainty he had never felt before, Britain would be whole again. Camelot rose before Arthur like a vision from a dream, its towers gleaming under the morning sun, its great walls standing as a testament to the kingdom he was destined to rule. Yet, within those walls, not all welcomed his return. The nobles who had once fought for power still whispered among themselves, their loyalty uncertain, their ambitions unbroken. Arthur knew that uniting Britain would not be won with a single battle. It would take more than a sword, more than victory on the battlefield. He needed something greater, something that would inspire not just warriors, but the very heart of the land itself. And so, he called his knights to council. The hall was filled with men of different houses, warriors who had pledged themselves to his cause, and those who still watched him with wary eyes. Among them stood Sir Bedivere, ever loyal Sir Kay, his brother by upbringing, Sir Gawain, fierce and honorable, and Sir Percival, the young knight whose heart was pure. Others had come as well, knights whose names would one day be legend. Arthur took his place at the center of the room, Excalibur resting at his side. He did not sit upon a grand throne, nor did he stand above the others. Instead, he faced them as equals, as men who shared in the burden of the kingdom. We cannot rule as those before us have, Arthur said, his voice steady. A king alone cannot hold a land together. Britain will not be built upon conquest, nor upon fear. It must be founded upon something stronger. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some listened with interest, others with skepticism. It was Sir Gawain who stepped forward first. "And what would you have us do, my king?" Arthur turned, his gaze sweeping over the gathered knights. "We will build a new order," he declared. "Not one ruled by bloodlines or titles, but by honor and duty. A brotherhood bound not by ambition, but by a shared oath." With that, he gestured to the great wooden table that had been prepared in the center of the chamber. It was unlike any other In the halls of kings, it was round. There will be no head at this table, Arthur continued. No man will sit above another. Here, all are equal, bound by the same code. We will fight not for power, but for justice. Not for wealth, but for the people. Silence filled the hall. Then, one by one, the knights stepped forward. Bedivere placed his hand upon the table first, his voice ringing clear. I swear my blade to this cause. Gawain followed, as do I. One by one, the knights took the oath, each pledging themselves to the round table and the vision it stood for. In that moment, something shifted, not just within the walls of Camelot, but in the very fabric of history. A new legend was born. Yet even as this new order was forged, shadows gathered beyond the walls. Far from Camelot, in the depths of the ancient forests, another force was rising. Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, watched from the darkness, her lips curling into a knowing smile. She had foreseen this moment, had felt the power stir within the land. Morgan had been raised in the shadows of kings, overlooked and cast aside, while Arthur had been hidden away, preparing for his destiny. But she too had power, magic older than Merlin's, knowledge that had been whispered to her by forces far beyond the mortal realm. And she would not be ignored. The night after the round table was formed, Arthur sat alone in the great hall, his mind heavy with the weight of all that lay ahead. He had won the loyalty of his knights, but the kingdom was still fragile, still vulnerable. He needed time to strengthen his rule, but fate would not grant him that luxury. Merlin entered, his expression dark. A storm is coming, Arthur. Arthur looked up. What do you mean? The shadows move, Merlin said. There are forces that do not wish to see Camelot rise. Your greatest challenges are yet to come. Arthur stood, his grip tightening around Excalibur's hilt. He had built the round table, had gathered the bravest knights in the land. But he knew now that steel alone would not be enough to protect the dream he had begun to shape. War was coming, not just of men, but of magic, and the battle for Camelot's soul had only just begun. The fires of Camelot burned brightly, but beyond its walls, a darkness stirred. In the shadowed depths of the forests, where the old gods still whispered through the trees, Morgan Le Fay prepared her move. She had watched Arthur rise, had seen him gather knights and forge his precious round table. But she knew that no kingdom, no matter how noble, was unbreakable. Every ruler had a weakness, and Arthur's weakness was his heart. Morgan was not driven by petty hatred or jealousy. Her purpose was greater than vengeance. She saw the flaw in Arthur's dream, the illusion of peace built on fragile oaths. The world was cruel, and it did not yield to ideals. Magic had ruled Britain long before kings had laid claim to its lands, and she would see it restored. If Arthur would not bow to the old ways, she would make him fall. Her weapon would not be an army nor steel. It would be betrayal. It began as whispers, small doubts, planted in the minds of those closest to Arthur. Knights who had fought beside him, began to question his rule, to wonder if the dream he promised was one that could truly be realized. Morgan's magic twisted these doubts, feeding them until they festered into resentment. And at the heart of it all was Lancelot. Sir Lancelot, Arthur's most trusted knight, was a man of unmatched skill, fierce loyalty, and an unshakable sense of honor. But even he was not immune to the schemes of fate. For in his heart, there was a love that should never have taken root, a love for Queen Guinevere. Morgan did not need to create this weakness. It already existed, hidden beneath years of duty and restraint. She merely needed to bring it into the light. One fateful evening, a letter found its way into Lancelot's hands. Its words were simple, but they carried a weight that shattered his resolve. She waits for you. Alone in the stillness of the night, Lancelot stood at the gates of the castle, his heart warring against his honor. He had sworn an oath to Arthur, had pledged his life to the Round Table, but the love he bore for Guinevere was a fire that had never faded. And so, against his better judgment, he stepped into the darkness. What he did not know was that he was walking into a trap. Morgan's magic wove through the night like an unseen serpent, guiding his steps. The queen's chambers lay ahead, the door slightly ajar, the flickering glow of candlelight spilling into the hallway. And there, within, stood Guinevere. She turned as he entered, her eyes filled with something unreadable fear, longing, regret. Lancelot, she whispered, his name a prayer and a curse all at once. But before either could speak another word, the doors were thrown open. Guards stormed into the chamber, their swords gleaming in the torchlight. Behind them stood Arthur, his expression unreadable, his gaze locked onto the man he had called brother. The silence was unbearable. Lancelot stepped back, his mind reeling. He had been deceived, played like a pawn in a game he had never wished to be part of. But it did not matter. The damage had been done. Arthur's voice, when it finally came, was not filled with rage, but with something far worse, betrayal. Tell me it isn't true. Guinevere's breath hitched, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Arthur, but there was no explanation that could undo what had already been seen. The Round Table, once unbreakable, began to splinter. Lancelot, unable to bear the shame, fled the castle, his name forever stained by the accusation of treachery. Guinevere, though queen, was now a prisoner within her own halls, her fate uncertain. And Arthur, the king who had once believed in unshakable loyalty, now found himself standing upon foundations that crumbled beneath him. Morgan's work was done, but even as Camelot fractured, she knew the final blow had yet to fall. Arthur's spirit had been wounded, but he still stood. To truly break him, she would need something greater. And so, she turned to the one force that had haunted Arthur since the day he had taken the throne. Mordred, far from the golden halls of Camelot, in a place untouched by Arthur's rule, a young warrior sharpened his blade. His name was whispered in hushed tones, a secret carried by the wind. He was Arthur's son, though he bore no love for the father who had never claimed him. Morgan had raised him well. Now, with Camelot divided, with Arthur's heart heavy and his knights in disarray, she would unleash the final storm. The battle for Britain was not yet over, but soon it would end. The air was thick with the weight of an impending storm. Arthur stood atop the walls of Camelot, his gaze fixed upon the horizon where the banners of war fluttered in the wind. The kingdom he had built, the dream he had forged, was crumbling before him. The betrayal of Lancelot and Guinevere had torn a wound deep within his heart. But there was no time to grieve, for beyond the fields, an army marched, a force unlike any he had faced before. At its head rode Mordred, Arthur's son, his blood, his doom. Mordred had been raised in the shadows, nurtured by Morgan Le Fay's hatred, trained to believe that Arthur's rule was a lie. He did not seek justice, nor peace. He sought destruction. To him, Arthur was not a king, but a thief who had stolen the throne that should have been his. And now, he had come to take it back by force. Merlin stood beside Arthur, his face lined with sorrow. "This battle will not end as the others have," the old sorcerer said. "There will be no victors here." Arthur gripped Excalibur tightly. "Then let it be the last battle," he murmured. As dawn broke over the battlefield of Camlin, the two armies clashed. Steel met steel in a symphony of chaos. The ground turned red with the blood of knights who had once called each other brothers. Arthur fought with all the fury left in his weary heart, Excalibur flashing like lightning as he cut through the ranks of those who sought to end him. But Mordred was relentless. The son was a mirror of the father, fierce, unyielding, and deadly. He moved through the battlefield like a shadow of vengeance, his blade seeking Arthur with every strike. The final confrontation was inevitable. The two met at the heart of the carnage, where the sounds of war faded, leaving only the echoes of fate. Arthur raised Excalibur. "It does not have to end this way," he said. "You are my son." Mordred's eyes burned with cold fire. "I am no son of yours." Their swords clashed. The battle that followed was brutal, each strike fueled by years of pain, by destiny itself. They were evenly matched. Arthur, the warrior king who had fought for a dream, and Mordred, the forsaken child who had only known betrayal. And then, in one final moment, both blades found their mark. Mordred's sword plunged into Arthur's side, piercing through armor and flesh. But even as pain racked his body, Arthur did not falter. With the last of his strength, he drove Excalibur through Mordred's chest, the sacred blade claiming the life of the son who had been his downfall. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Mordred staggered back, his eyes wide in shock, before crumpling to the ground. Arthur, mortally wounded, collapsed beside him. The storm that had loomed over the battlefield finally broke, rain washing away the blood as the last remnants of the battle faded into the wind. Camelot had fallen. As Arthur lay dying, Sir Bedivere knelt beside him, tears in his eyes. "My king." Arthur's breath was shallow, his vision blurred. "Excalibur, it must return to the lake," he whispered. Bedivere hesitated. The sword had been the symbol of Arthur's reign, the weapon that had united a kingdom. But he could not deny the king's final wish. He carried Excalibur to the edge of a still lake, the waters untouched by the horrors of war. With a heavy heart, he cast the sword into the depths. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from beneath the surface, a hand emerged, pale and ghostly, catching the blade before vanishing into the darkness below. Arthur's time had come, but his story was not yet over. Merlin stood over his fallen king, his face unreadable. "He cannot die here," he murmured. "Not yet." The old sorcerer summoned the last of his power, calling upon the ancient forces that had guided Arthur since the beginning. A mist rose from the battlefield, thick and ethereal, shrouding everything in its embrace. When it cleared, Arthur was gone, far across the land, hidden beyond the reach of men. Lay Avalon, the island of legend, where time stood still, where the wounded could heal, where kings did not die, but merely slept. It was here that Arthur was taken, his body resting beneath the golden light of an eternal dawn. And so the legend was born. Arthur, the once and future king, would slumber until the world needed him again. Until the day Britain called for her true ruler once more. As the mist of Avalon swallowed him whole, the story of Camelot came to an end. But the dream of a just king, of a land united, of a world shaped by honor and courage, would never fade. For as long as men whispered his name, Arthur would live on. And one day, when the world had need of him again, he would rise.